Alright, what up guys? Today we are doing something a little bit different because today we are going to be ranking all of the weapons in Fable The Lost Chapters / Fable Anniversary. Now there are going to be a couple caveats to this list. First of all, we're only going to be dealing with legendary weapons. We're not going to include any of the baseline weapons. It's just going to be the legendary versions of those weapons. And the second caveat is that we're not going to be doing any of the DLC weapons from Fable Anniversary, although I might consider doing a separate tier list on just the DLC weapons. So let me know how you guys feel about that, and I might come through with the DLC weapon tier list. But for this one, we're just going to be doing the non-DLC legendary weapons that are available in the Lost Chapters or Anniversary. So without further ado, let's get started with the Orkon's Club. So we got the Orkon's Club, which, if you guys aren't aware, actually, this is technically the legendary version of a stick. As you can see here, the club appears to be a legendary version of the stick, as each weapon type has at least one legendary equivalent, yet by comparison, the stick is in fact longer. It's a pretty basic weapon. There's no augments, no augment slots. It actually does a reasonable amount of damage, surprisingly. Like, for a legendary stick, 140 is actually pretty impressive, but it is a pretty much useless weapon because, well, there's no augments, right? So there's almost no reason to use this weapon as opposed to literally almost any master level weapon, right? Like even the 120 damage master pickaxe, like you add a couple augments to that, it's gonna be better than Orkon's Club. And Orkon's Club is also, like, I'm not even gonna lie, it's kind of just ugly and stupid. There's not a whole lot going on here. It's a very basic looking weapon, and it's just really not all that exciting or all that useful. So we're gonna be starting things off with a heavy-handed F tier for the Orkon's Club, because it really is just a pretty useless weapon. The only time I ever actually seriously considered using it as a weapon was when I did my stick playthrough. I pretty much just used it as a loophole for late game with the stick. Not a whole lot of use case for this weapon. Pretty ugly, pretty bad, F tier. Alright, now moving on, we've actually got the Frying Pan. The Frying Pan is basically a super duper legendary weapon because of the amount of augment slots it has, which in the original version of the game, it has 5 empty augment slots, but I think it's actually because of the engine limitations of Anniversary or something like that. It only has 4 augment slots, and that's because in the Lost Chapters there was actually the augment slot glitch. Even though it only showed 4 augment slots, you would get 5 augment slots to use, whereas in Anniversary that glitch doesn't work, so you only get as many augment slots as like actually shows up in the user interface, which is 4. So I am actually gonna have technically 2 separate rankings for this Frying Pan. But yeah, it ends up being the only weapon in the game that has that many augment slots, and so it ends up being extremely overpowered for doing things like attaching health or mana augmentations to. And you can actually dig it up before getting the treasure clues, but if you dig up the Frying Pan before getting all 6 treasure clues, it will not have any of the augment slots. I think this one is an obvious one, but I am gonna actually have to make a bit of a alteration to the playing field here. Alright, super sloppy way to do that, but we got our SS tier now. That's gonna be how we do that. So Frying Pan is an obvious S tier, but we're also gonna duplicate this layer and put it in double S tier. The Lost Chapters Frying Pan, not the Anniversary Frying Pan. We'll label the Anniversary one as the Anniversary one. So, Anniversary Frying Pan and the original Frying Pan. And with that, we will be moving on to the Harbinger. So for those of you who don't know about the Harbinger, this is the one that you pull out of the Sword in the Stone over by the Temple of Avo. In my opinion, this is honestly one of the worst, if not the worst. Let me just do a quick comparison here. It ain't even the worst somehow. It definitely could be better. Augments are a little underwhelming. You have a sharpening and a piercing, so it's going to be good against like the 1 or 2 enemies that are weak against piercing augmentations, I guess. It does have 1 sharpening augmentation, so, you know, whatever. It could have been weaker, I suppose, but the fact that it's a legendary weapon with only 2 augments is kind of sad. Ideally, expect your legendary weapons to have at least as many augments as a master weapon. Like a master version of a longsword literally holds more augments than this, so it's pretty weird. I would honestly almost wager that if you just like put 3 sharpening augmentations on a master longsword, that it would possibly do more damage than this. I don't know. Because it does such an underwhelming amount of damage and has such an underwhelming amount of augments for like the amount of, I don't want to say effort that goes into retrieving this weapon, but like the qualifications required for receiving this sword. Like you would expect the sword to be a good good weapon, since it's like only the strongest person in the land can pull this sword out of the game. But it's really honestly not that good of a weapon. It's extremely underwhelming for what I think at least that it should be, and for that reason we're not going to be getting a very good rating on this one, sadly. There's definitely a worse sword, so it's like pretty bad, but it's still somehow not the worst of the legendary longswords. So I'm gonna put it in D tier. It's pretty bad, pretty useless, so D tier is pretty good. All right, next up we have Avos tier, which is the Lost Chapters version of the Sword of Aeons. So in the original version of the game, there was only ever the Sword of Aeons. You either destroyed it forever and never got another chance to have a good weapon again, or you kept it and you had a crazy evil weapon. In the Lost Chapters, they actually gave you the choice to get essentially the Sword of Aeons back if you decide to do the good thing and throw it into the portal. You get a good version of the Sword of Aeons, so you still get to rule the land, but without ruling the land or whatever. And yeah, you know, for all intents and purposes, it is the exact same sword as the Sword of Aeons, so I mean, theoretically, it's just as good, but from an aesthetic level, I never really liked Avos tier. It looks kind of awkwardly fat compared to the Sword of Aeons. Like, if we bust out the Sword of Aeons real quick, it's got this kind of like narrower, sleeker look to it. The cross guard on the Avos tier is kind of ugly and awkward looking by comparison. It's straight across, which is traditional, sure, but the Sword of Aeons just has like this really cool swept back look to its cross guard. Even just like the handle and hilt look a bit more interesting on the Sword of Aeons. It's got this cool, like, more tapered look with this really magnificent gold pommel on it, whereas this one's like a little bit on the boring side. It's a little bit darker, so it's not quite as accented. The pommel is nowhere near as exciting. And then yeah, on top of like not having like the same sort of sleek look as the Sword of Aeons, this stupid dividing line in the middle pisses me off so much. It just triggers my OCD so bad. Like, I just want this line to be straight. Like, why couldn't they have just made it like basically the same as the Sword of Aeons but different, right? Like, they really had to go off and do whatever this hell is here. That's a deal breaker for me, honestly. This weird little squiggly S-curve instead of just a straight line down the middle, for some reason, pisses me off so much. And despite the fact that it's actually a pretty damn good weapon, I'm gonna put it in A tier. It's just not quite S tier for me. It's kind of ugly. And we're also gonna tie that into the ranking of the Sword of Aeons, but just like the frying pan, there is a little bit of a caveat here. So first things first, we got the Sword of Aeons. This is an obvious S tier weapon. It is just like the weapon of the game. It is literally the weapon of the game. All the reasons that I mentioned previously, just aesthetically, it is a very aesthetically pleasing weapon. This is probably one of my favorite swords of any RPG. It is such an iconic weapon to me and to a lot of people. But not only is it just iconic, but it is actually extremely powerful. And what's even better is that you can assassin rush glitch to get this literally as soon as you leave the Heroes Guild training. So that's pretty cool, but it does actually get better, as you'll notice we have one that is labeled the OG, because there are actually two different versions of the Sword of Aeons. For those who are unaware and never played the original version of Fable on the Xbox, back in the day, the Sword of Aeons was actually this very extremely overpowered sword that did a whopping 550 damage. Now, the caveat there, of course, was by the time you got the sword, you were completely done with the game, and there was literally almost nothing to do other than just kill enemies. I mean, you were out of quests by the time you got this sword, so there was really not a whole lot you could do with this sword functionally. But yeah, in the Lost Chapters, they decided to nerf it heavily and literally more than halved its damage. But yeah, for that reason, we gotta put the OG in the double S tier, because it really is just that overpowered of a weapon. I mean, 550 damage is absolutely insane. Now, this next one is actually a bit of a doozy. It is the only one that ends up being worse than the Harbinger somehow, and this one is the Avenger. And similar, actually, to the Harbinger. Harbinger? I don't know. How do you guys want to pronounce that one? You tell me. This is one where the qualifications to get it really just do not match the actual specifications of the weapon, right? So, like the Harbinger, you had to be like basically max level strength and pull out the sword that only the strongest in all the land can pull out. And then you get this sword that's kind of extremely underwhelming. Well, this one, this is what you get for the 30 silver key chest, right? Like, this was like the big kahuna, right? Like, in the original version of the game, there was only, I think, either 20 or 25 silver keys. And so for the Lost Chapters, they added some more keys. Now, because there was 30 silver keys, they could add a 30 silver key chest. And there's only one 30 silver key chest in the entire game. So it is literally the big fucking kahuna. And they wasted it. They wasted it on this terrible fucking sword that, much like the Harbinger, only has 2 augments. This one at least has like 2 different elements, so I mean, it'll be a little bit more handy against a little bit more enemies with weaknesses, but 180 damage for like what is essentially the hardest weapon to obtain in the entire game, because you have to get all 30 silver keys and then get to the very end of the game to get this whopper of a chest that has basically nothing in it, because this is probably the least useful sword in the entire game. Not only do you not even get a chance to use this weapon until you are quite literally knocking at you're knocking at the door of the end of the game, right? Like by the time you can get this weapon, the only thing there's left to do is the necropolis, and then like literally collecting the hero souls and then killing Jack of Blades again, right? Like those are like the 3 things that you could do with this sword: necropolis, collect the hero souls, and kill Final Jack. And it's really like this terrible of a weapon. Like, what is the point of this weapon? Like, if it was something that you got like halfway through the game, sure, not bad. But the fact that it's literally like the big kahuna of the silver key chest, like this is the big prize, but like you don't get it until the very end of the game. So it's just so fucking useless. It really is. And for that reason, the Avenger honestly gets F tier. I think I was actually going to put that in E tier, because I was like, oh, it's not quite that bad. But like, no, like now that I'm like actually considering like all of the factors here, because like originally I was just thinking like, oh, it's a bad weapon, does bad damage, doesn't have very good augments. But then like I remembered like just how bad the scenario is of like not even getting it until the end of the game, and it being like literally the best prize in the game from the 30 key chest. Like, no, you're getting F tier, buddy. That's unfor-fucking givable, bro. And honestly, with that, we might as well just put Harbinger in E tier, because the only reason I didn't put it in E tier is because I thought the Avenger was going to be in E tier, so get a little bit of a correction going on there too. All right, and this next one is probably a bit of a fan favorite actually, and it's the Katana Hiryu. The Katana Hiryu is actually probably one of the best legendary weapons in the game. Pretty much barring the Sword of Aeons, this is the best legendary weapon because it's the best of the light weapons, right? So the only thing that's gonna be better than the Katana Hiryu are heavy weapons, right? That's perfectly fine though, because again, it's a light weapon. You get that swing speed along with it. But yeah, this is the one you get from Lady Grey's bedroom from a 15 silver key chest. So you either need to marry Lady Grey or become the mayor. Not too bad. Basically, as soon as you do the arena, you can get this weapon, which means you can use it for a solid like half of the game. So you actually get some pretty good usage out of it. Again, pretty much like the best in slot for the light weapons, excluding of course the Sword of Aeons, which if I remember correctly, I think the Sword of Aeons might technically be a heavy weapon, but it's like a one-handed heavy weapon. Pretty damn good weapon. What are the augments? Surprisingly shit augments, but it makes up for it with the damage, right? Like the fact that like one of the two like potential best weapons in the game, the Avenger and the Harbinger, couldn't even do like over 200 damage, it's like, bro, unforgivable. So the Katana Hiryu, while it may not have the good augments or anything, the damage totally makes up for it, and it's a pretty cool looking katana. So pretty good sword. I will call it a solid A tier. It's not quite S tier, right? But definitely a good weapon. And for this next one, it's actually another pretty damn useful one in my opinion, and it's the Cutlass bluetane. So this is of course the legendary Cutlass that you get from the combat multiplier demon door. So you have to get a combat multiplier of 14 or higher to achieve this bad boy, which honestly isn't all that hard. If you have been struggling with the combat multiplier demon door like many people did, check out my video on it. I've got a couple videos that make it super duper easy. Honestly, a super easy demon door to get into. And yeah, essentially like as soon as you leave the guild, you can make a beeline for that demon door, get yourself the 14 combat multiplier, get in, and get what is honestly one of the best legendary weapons in the game. Not necessarily damage wise, but just like how useful it is from how early on in the game. You don't even have to like do any sort of glitching exploits like with the Sword of Aeons to get it. You can just get this thing completely naturally from the beginning of the game, which is super sick. It's actually a pretty cool looking weapon. It kind of reminds me of like the glass weapons from Morrowind. I like to imagine that it's this like serrated glass blade. I don't know, it's pretty cool looking though. Underwhelming on the augments. We literally only have one augment, and it's a lightning augment, but at least it is elemental, so we will do some extra damage to whatever enemies are weak against lightning. We only do 165 damage, but again, when you consider how early on you can get this weapon, 165 damage is honestly massive. Because yeah, if you get this thing at the beginning of the game, there's not a whole lot of stuff you can get that does 165 damage without just completely glitching the game to get like the Solus greatsword early or like the Sword of Aeons early. Like this is about as good as it gets without glitching. Not a whole lot to say other than great weapon. I'll probably put that in A tier. It's a pretty good one. Easily A tier. Probably gonna be a lot of those A tiers, but yeah, definitely one of them. Next up, we have Ronok the Axe. It's a bit of an interesting one. So for this one, you actually, the only way to get the Ronok axe is to marry Lady Grey. So if you marry Lady Grey, you get access to a demon door that wants you to marry somebody posh with a title. So yeah, you literally only have one chance in the game to get Ronok the axe. So if you decide to expose Lady Grey, you're screwed. There's zero opportunity to get this weapon. Although I think you can actually just assassin rush into any demon door, so theoretically it's always available. That being said, it's slightly underwhelming, but it's actually really not that bad. Yeah, the Cutlass bluetane does the exact same amount of damage. Technically has 2 augments, but if it has a sharpening augment, it really technically doesn't have an augment at all. So it really only has a silver augment, which is actually kind of a tough one, but it is actually a pretty decently strong weapon. 165 damage for an axe is actually kind of insane. Much like the pickaxes, like the master axes just don't really do very much damage at all. I want to say they do like 135 damage or something like that. So considering it's an axe, this actually does a pretty insane amount of damage. 165 damage with the silver augmentation, that is definitely a contender for like the White Balverine quest or something like that. You know what I just realized? You can't even get it before. I'm stupid. You cannot get this before the White Balverine, so it is not a contender for the White Balverine quest. Because yeah, you cannot get this until after the arena. So yeah, actually now that I consider that point, it is basically the exact same thing as the Cutlass bluetane, except for you cannot get it until like more than halfway through the game, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, it's kind of cool, but it is like technically kind of useless for that reason, because there's just so many better options that you can get after that point, and so many similar options that you can get before that point, that it's just like, what is even the point of this weapon, right? So we'll put it in B tier. It's still a cool weapon. It's still somewhat useful, but it is kind of ruined by the fact that, yeah, you don't get it until after the arena. Like, White Balverine quest is the first chance to fight a White Balverine. Arena is your second chance to fight a White Balverine. What the fuck are you going to do with that silver augmentation? Kill normal Balverines? It hardly does anymore against a normal Balverine. That's stupid. God, I almost want to put this in C tier, really. Putting it in C tier, yeah, because it really actually, like, the augment makes it super useless. Like, there's no use for a silver augment after the arena. Like, that's actually stupid. What the fuck were they thinking? Could have been a B tier if like the augments were like a little more useful, but there's not a single White Balverine you will be fighting with Ronok the axe. That's insane. All right, next up we have the Dollmaster's mace. It's an interesting one because it's almost a really good one, but it just kind of barely falls short in my opinion. I want to say technically this is the earliest instance of a mana augmentation that you can obtain. Again, without doing any sort of exploiting or cheating or anything like that, because technically you could get the mana augmentation in the silver key chest where you fight Thunder. Like technically you could get in there like super duper early and get that one, but as far as like not breaking the game goes, this is the earliest instance of a mana augmentation that you can obtain, so it is pretty cool for that reason. But even still, it's a bit of a doozy because I don't think you can actually get it until you get to Knothole Glade because of the bright plate mail suit requirement. I think you can get 2 of the pieces from traveling traders in the Darkwood area, and then you can get 2 of the pieces from traveling traders in the Witchwood area. If I think that's what it is, if I remember correctly. So you can technically get it like right before the arena, and then the arena ends up being the first instance of being able to buy the full bright plate suit. The only way to get the Dollmaster's mace is to get the bright plate suit first, which is surprisingly harder to get than you would think it is, and you surprisingly can't get it until like a decent ways into the game. Theoretically, you can get this mace at like about the same time that you can get the other mana augmentation, so it kind of arbitrates itself or redundifies itself, whatever. It becomes kind of redundant, right? It's like, oh, you're finally at the point where you can get the Dollmaster's mace. Like, well, if I'm at that point, I'm also pretty much at the point where I can fight Thunder and just get that mana augmentation instead and make a better weapon, right? So it is kind of a weird one, and again, it is a mace, and the maces are again one of those weapons that just don't do very much damage at all from the get-go. And so the master version ends up being, I think, the weakest of the master weapons. Oh, nope, Wellow's pickhammer's worse. Holy shit, that's crazy. So yeah, pretty bad weapon, only 135 damage, so like damage is definitely not going to be the use case for this. It's really just going to be that mana augmentation. So it's like if you're doing like a mage playthrough, this would be like your first goal would be get the Dollmaster's mace, and then you would work on trying to get other mana augmentations to hopefully increase your number of mana augmentations to the maximum being 8, right? So this is like the very first baby step to mana augmentations, right? So there is like at least some amount of use case there, but it's one of those like too little too late scenarios. And then it's like not only is it too little too late, it's really only got that one mana augmentation and no other augments, and it only does 135 damage, so it ends up being pretty much entirely useless as a weapon. It's really only good as like a supplement for being a mage, right? Where are we gonna put this thing? I think we're gonna actually put this thing in D tier, because it actually is just pretty fucking useless. It doesn't really do any damage as a weapon, and by the time you can get it, there's pretty much better options for mana augmentations. So it's like, why even use the Dollmaster's mace at all? Like, you're literally using it for a split second, honestly. So yeah, D tier seems pretty fair. So next up, and I did a little bit of a sneak peek there, but we've got the Wellow's pickhammer. Like I said, pickhammers never really had too much to write home about. The Wellow's pickhammer is not really any different. We only have 120 damage. Pretty abysmal, honestly. We got 2 piercing augmentations, so you know, if we're fighting anything with piercing weaknesses, it's actually a pretty good contender for that. But honestly, I think just overall damage would probably be better. But on the bright side, this is one of the weapons that you can get pretty early on in the game. So either just be super evil or eat 11 crunchy chicks in front of the demon door at the Greatwood Gorge, and you get the Wellow's pickhammer. It's honestly a pretty easy and early weapon to get, so a lot of the stats are pretty forgivable in that context, that like literally you can get this weapon during like the first real quest of the game, so that's pretty cool. Pretty bad weapon, but it's also a pretty early weapon, so in the context of early weapons, it really is not all that bad of a weapon. If you're not really trying to like challenge yourself with that demon door for the combat multiplier, you know, obviously this is a much better option at the beginning of the game, but this is a equally easy, if not easier option. Not quite as strong, but it's like you just walk in and walk out and you get this thing basically. It's pretty easy. Context definitely matters for a lot of this stuff, and so does appearance. But yeah, I think that's a good example of context mattering there. And look at that, we actually got every single slot filled now, so now we can care a little bit less about filling each tier slot. So next up, we actually have one of my all-time favorites, and it's the Murren greathammer. I'm gonna try not to let my biases bias me here, but we've got the probably coolest looking greathammer in the entire game. One of the coolest looking weapons in the entire game, in my opinion. I just really like the way this greathammer looks. I don't even know what that is, like a big block of granite or something. Like, what even is that? It's huge though. 270 damage, pretty damn good. Obviously not up there with like the absolute greats, like the Solus greatsword or anything like that, but 270 damage is pretty huge and respectable, that's for sure. We get an experience augmentation, which is a pretty interesting one for sure. It is a little bit too late on the experience augmentation, because by the time you've got 20 silver keys, I'm sure you're either maxed or close to it. Piercing and experience augmentation, fairly decent combination of augments, especially if you still need the experience. 270 damage, pretty respectable, but for me, mostly it's just going to be the design of the weapon. I just really like the look of the Murren greathammer. It's always been one of my favorite weapons. Pretty easy to find, but gonna be a little bit of work to obtain. It's above average. It's not like one of the best weapons in the game, but it's a pretty respectable weapon for sure. You know, my biases would love to put this thing in S tier just because I love it so much, but we're gonna put her in A tier. It's a damn good weapon, but there's obviously some stuff better than it, so we gotta leave some breathing room for S tier, yeah. And then next up we have the sister of the Murren greathammer, the Murren greataxe, which is also a pretty damn rad weapon, but does a little bit less damage. We don't get we get the same piercing augmentation, but we do not get the experience augmentation, sadly. It only does 240 damage instead of 270, so it's a bit weaker. And it is from the 15 silver key chest at the Hook Coast Lighthouse. So, you know, it's a little bit easier to get than the Murren greathammer. You only need 15 silver keys as opposed to 20. That being said, you cannot get it until you reach that point in the game. So, you know, theoretically, you could get the Murren greathammer like way early compared to the Murren greataxe. So it becomes a little weird. Like, it does less damage. You get it much later in the game, technically. Has less augments. And it's just, I don't know. It's cool looking though. It really is actually super cool looking. I think we have to put it in B. I'd love to put it in A tier with the Murren greataxe just because I really like the design of the weapon, but I think we kind of have to put it in B tier just on like the principle alone of the fact that it's not as good as the greathammer, right? Makes sense. Next up, we have an absolute banger of a classic, which I think speaks for itself, honestly. And we have the Solus greatsword. And we already know, everybody knows about the Solus greatsword. It is literally the best weapon in the game damage-wise. 313 damage right off the bat. You can get it as soon as you gain access to Bowerstone North, whether that's right after the arena or just using the Bowerstone North early method. This ends up being the best weapon in the game that you can get, not only in general, but literally at the beginning of the game. You can just go into Bowerstone North early, do a little bit of trade exploiting, get yourself the best weapon in the game and you're fucking good, bro. That being said, we've got the flame augmentation, the health augmentation, and the sharpening augmentation. And there are actually technically 2 different versions of this weapon. So on the Xbox version of the game, for some reason this doesn't work on the PC, just the Xbox. If you're familiar with how your spouse in the game will give you gifts if you, like, you know, flirt with her and treat her right and all that stuff, the same thing happens with Lady Grey, except for Lady Grey gives you the greatest gift of all time, the Solus greatsword. But not only will she gift you the Solus greatsword, she will gift you the Solus greatsword with no augments. Not no augment slots, no augments. So you get a Solus greatsword that you can fill with your own augments to reach a maximum of 345 damage, I believe. Super cool looking weapon. It's always been one of my favorite looking weapons. Just that curvy sword look is just super duper cool. It always reminded me of like Jack's minions and like their weapons or whatever. So it's always been one of my favorite weapons for that reason, just because it made me feel like I got a cool weapon like those guys, right? But yeah, best damage in the game, some really good augments, honestly. The health augmentation, super useful. Flame augmentation, pretty basic, but it's going to be good against at least some sort of enemy weakness. And then yeah, you can get it pretty easily and early on, and like even if you just get it naturally, the fact that you can get this right after the arena is actually pretty massive, because it's an insanely powerful and useful weapon that you can actually use for a decent chunk of the game, right? Amazing weapon. I think it speaks for itself. I think it's probably pretty obvious that we're going to be putting it in S tier, with of course that secondary caveat of the no augment version, of course, double S tier, because it doesn't really get much better than a Solus greatsword that you can attach your own augments to, because that's crazy. That means you can just make a super duper powerful Solus greatsword with 3 sharpening augmentations, and that would be crazy. All right, next up we've got another absolute classic, and it is the Bereaver. Now the Bereaver is a really awesome weapon, but it is also kind of in that category of too little too late, because you can't get this weapon until literally the very end of the game, right? Like, you have to have made it all the way to the Necropolis quest of the Lost Chapters before you can even think about getting this weapon. And then the way to get this weapon is to forfeit all of your silver keys to the demon door, which again, by that point in the game, you've probably got all the silver keys anyway, and ideally opened all the silver key chests too, so it's not like that huge of a ask by that point in the game. But yeah, it's an amazing weapon with, again, like 2 caveated versions, with the original Xbox release and the PC release. In the Xbox release, the Bereaver comes with 2 empty augmentation slots. If you put 2 sharpening augmentations on it, it will do 345 damage. This will match the Solus greatsword. You fill its empty slot with a sharpening augmentation. PC release, the Bereaver comes with only 1 augmentation slot that is already filled, therefore equaling the Solus greatsword impossible, right? So it's an interesting one. It kind of depends on which version of the game you're playing. It's a good weapon, it's a cool weapon, it's about as good as the Solus greatsword, but you really, like, you get it at the very end of the game, so it ends up kind of falling short in that regard. I think I originally had different plans for this one, but I think my plans are getting moved down exactly 1 slot. So we're gonna put the PC version of the sword in A tier and the Xbox version in S tier. I think I was originally going to put the Xbox version in double S and the PC version in S tier, but with the comparison to the Solus greatsword, and especially with the context of, like, again, when and how you get this weapon, on a matter of principle, you really only can put it lower than the Solus greatsword. So yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Let's move on to the last of the melee weapons here, the Sentius. Now the Sentius is of course the weapon you get from the Temple of Avo. So you gotta, like, donate a pretty good chunk of cash, probably somewhere between like 30 and 100,000 depending on your good ranking or whatever. If you're really good disposition, you're probably gonna have to donate a lot more, apparently up to like 320,000, which is insane if you're fully good, but usually it's not that hard to get. We got 255 damage, which is pretty decent. You get a silver augmentation and a piercing augmentation, so this is actually an actual contender for the White Balverine quest, because you can actually obtain this before the White Balverine quest. You just have to have the money to donate for it. It's an overall pretty acceptable weapon. It does a pretty acceptable amount of damage. 255 is very decent for how early and easily you can obtain this one. Kind of falls somewhere between the Murren greataxe and the Murren greathammer, except for it's way easier to get and you can get it way sooner. But yeah, we got that silver augmentation, so actually pretty decent for fighting the White Balverine. Piercing augmentation is alright. There's a couple enemies, I guess, that are weak against piercing, but whatever. It also looks pretty decent. It's not a bad looking weapon at all, that's for sure. It's just usually I have something better by that point. I feel like I've either like glitched and got the Sword of Aeons, or like glitched and got the Solus greatsword, but pretty simple, but pretty good. Pretty easy to get, so I like it. Where are we gonna put this bad boy? It's definitely deserving of at least A tier. We'll put her there. All right, so that is all of the legendary melee weapons, but we still got a couple ranged weapons there, don't we, buddy? So first up, we've got the Arken's crossbow, which is, you know, it's a crossbow, I guess. You need 15 silver keys to get it. It's in the chest at Darkwood Lake, so it's not like super difficult to get by any means. You can get 15 silver keys pretty early from what I remember, at least. Got 220 damage, which isn't completely huge. We really gotta make the comparison to Skorm's bow here. Skorm's bow does 264 damage by comparison, and also has a faster shooting speed since it's, well, a bow and not a crossbow. I cannot lie, it actually greatly confuses me that they did not make the crossbow stronger than the bow, because like if you had a U crossbow versus a U bow, the crossbow would be stronger, right? So for some reason they decided to make the legendary crossbow 44 damage weaker than the legendary bow, which really kind of makes you wonder, like, what actually is the point of this weapon? It does have a silver augmentation, so I mean, I guess you could do some Balverine slaying with it or whatever. But we also have piercing and flame, so it's all elemental shit, essentially. Weakness-derived augmentations. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, I feel like it should do more damage. Like, I feel like if this thing did 320 damage, it would be an absolute banger of a weapon, but I think it just falls completely short on damage, especially when there's an actual bow that does more damage. It just doesn't make any sense to use a crossbow if the bow does more damage. Like, the whole point of the crossbow is that, sure, it's a little bit slow and clunky to use, but it does so much more damage than a bow that it's worth it in certain scenarios. If it doesn't do more damage than the bow, there's nothing there that makes it worth it. It's just a weaker, slower bow. And it's not even like it's easier to get than the Skorm's bow. Like, Skorm's bow, literally right when you leave the guild, you can just hire a bodyguard, go to the Chapel of Skorm at midnight, donate the bodyguard, and boom, you've got Skorm's bow, right? Like, it is honestly, like, for how kind of hard the RNG can be sometimes, it's possibly one of the easiest weapons to get in the entire game, because it requires almost literally no setup. You just have to donate one body. You hire one bodyguard, donate his body to the Chapel of Skorm, and you get the strongest bow in the entire game, right? Like, whereas with this, you gotta like go around and collect 15 silver keys, which, I mean, you're gonna have to advance at least somewhat in the game to get those 15 silver keys, right? So I don't know. It's a weird one. It's like not a bad weapon, but again, context is everything with these weapons here, so I don't know, man. I can't put it too low because it does actually do like some damage. Like, it's not like a useless weapon by any means, but like, god damn, you know, like, what is the point of this weapon, right? I don't get it. I'm damn near tempted to put this thing straight to F tier, but like, it's not 100% useless. It's just like, there's no reason to use it instead of the Skorm's bow is basically all it is. And with that, we're gonna go to the last on the list, which is Skorm's bow, which is actually a mod. You cannot get this with the vanilla version of the game. Yeah, no, that is like the weirdest ongoing like meme shit post that has ever fucking existed ever. There's just been this ongoing like 5 or 6 year long like inside joke on the Fable Hits posting Facebook group that like Skorm's bow is a mod. I don't even know how it started. I'm sure it just started because like one person was like so butthurt that they couldn't get the Skorm's bow that they're like, I don't know, it must be a mod or something because I've never been able to get it, right? Like, one person was probably just being like so obtuse about the Skorm's bow and called it a mod, and then it just stuck, and now everybody calls it a mod. Like, you cannot say anything about Skorm's bow without people being like, oh dude, I love that mod. Oh, you mean the mod? Yeah, I only play the vanilla version. It's so fucking stupid, but whatever. Anyways, definitely speaks for itself. Strongest bow in the game. I think honestly the way that the damage scaling for bows works with the accuracy skill, I want to say this actually ends up being stronger than the strongest melee weapon. I think Skorm's bow is in a way the actual strongest weapon in the game. There we go. Yeah, this bow can do more damage per hit than any other weapon without using any augmentations. A hit from Skorm's bow is far more devastating than a regular hit from any other weapon. And yeah, that relies heavily on your accuracy rating, because obviously the damage is not as high as like the Solus greatsword, but the damage multiplier received from your accuracy level for your bow is higher than the increase that you get from strength for your melee weapons, right? Anyway, this one, Skorm's bow, the mod, I think I'm gonna slap this bitch in double S tier. It is just such an insanely overpowered and extremely just useful weapon that I don't think I could put it anything lower than double S tier. It is arguably the best weapon in the game, but like, as far as ranged weapons, like, it does not get any better than this. So like, it has to be double S tier because it is the upper echelon of ranged combat in Fable. But anyways, that kind of does it. That is actually the whole list there. So taking it from the top, we've got our double S tier. We've got Frying pan. We've got the OG version of the Sword of Aeons, not the Lost Chapters, you know, sort of nerfed version. We've got the no augment version of the Solus greatsword, and of course Skorm's bow. The standard S tier, we have the anniversary version of the frying pan, which is just one augment short, but it's still a banger of a weapon. We've got the Lost Chapters version of the Sword of Aeons. We've got the normal version of the Solus greatsword, and then we've got the Xbox version of the Bereaver. Next up in the A tier, we've got Avos tier. It's a good weapon, it's just kind of ugly, it's whatever. Katana hiryu, absolute banger of a weapon. Best katana in game. I think it's the best light weapon aside from your Solus greatswords and your Avos tier. You got your Cutlass bluetane, one of the best weapons you can get early on in the game. Super duper useful for the early game sections. And we've got the Murren greathammer, one of my all-time favorites, and I think the best heavy weapon damage short of the Solus greatsword and Bereaver. Speaking of Bereaver, we've got the PC version of the Bereaver with only its one additional slot, I believe. Next, we've got the Sentius, which is actually a really nice weapon. It does get better than the Sentius, but because it's actually pretty easy to get, you can get it pretty early on. It ends up being actually really useful. Next up in B tier, we've got the Wellow's pickhammer, which is like not that great of a weapon, but you can get it very early in the game by just eating a bunch of crunchy chicks essentially. So you don't have to do a whole lot for it. And if we're comparing it to like early game weapons like your iron and steel, that sort of thing, it's actually a pretty valid weapon to use. So B tier. Then we've got the Murren greataxe, which not quite as good as the great hammer, but it's still a pretty decent weapon. You can't really get it until you get to Hook Coast. That's a bit of a problem, but it's still a decent weapon, and it looks really cool. It's honestly one of the coolest looking weapons in the game. Next up, C tier, we've got Ronok the axe. Could have been a much better weapon if it wasn't so limited in its scope. It's a silver augmented weapon that you cannot get until after you've fought every single white Balverine in the game. Every single white Balverine is gone, and then you finally get this like best in slot axe that has a silver augmentation. Like, why? Literally, why? Not only that, but you have to marry Lady Grey to get it. Like, what? It looks cool though, and it does actually decent damage for an axe, but they really dropped the ball on that one. They really did. And then we got Arken's crossbow in C tier. It's a good crossbow, but it's just like, why is it weaker than Skorm's bow, and why is it harder to get than Skorm's bow? Doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to get Arken's crossbow, just get Skorm's bow. D tier, we've got the Dollmaster mace, which really had so much potential, but again, it's like too little, too late. Once again, a lot of these are really just too little, too late. And this one, it's not really the too late part that matters so much. It's the too little part, really. Too little damage, too little augments, too little use case. Kind of a bummer of a weapon that really could have been a lot better. Next up, we've got the Harbinger in tier E, which isn't really a too little, too late, but more of like just an underwhelming prize for an overwhelming task, right? Like, you have to be the strongest person in all the land to pull this sword out, and it's gonna be this useless. Why? At least make it feel like a weapon that like only the strongest person could pull out of the ground. Like, you pull out what feels like it's about to be the best weapon. It's like, oh, this thing's kind of lame actually. What the fuck? Somehow this is not even the worst that it could get for a legendary sword. And so we had to have F tier with Orkon's club, obviously, because it's fucking Orkon's club. What are you gonna do with Orkon's club, honestly? It's a pretty bad weapon. But then, yeah, the Avenger, bro. Why did they make this sword? First of all, why did they make this sword? Second of all, why is this the prize for the best silver key chest in the game? Like, this sword is the entire reason why I only ever collect 25 keys. Because there's no, why would you collect 30 keys when the prize doesn't matter, right? What are you gonna actually use this sword? You're gonna collect all 30 silver keys so that you can get this sword at the very end of the game and fight Jack of Blades with it? Like, why? Why would you do that? Doesn't make sense. Like, the only thing you get to fight with that sword is Jack of Blades, essentially, right? And why would you use that sword to fight Jack of Blades? Why would you do that? Like, they could have made it a good weapon and they just didn't. Like, they could have just not even put this in the game. Never collect 30 keys. It is the biggest scam of all time. Just stop at 25. You do not need this sword at all. But anyways, that was a bit of a doozy of a tier list, but it was a fun one. And I think we got a pretty good list going on here. We filled all the slots, which is nice. We actually have a pretty good amount of them at A tier or higher. So yeah, a lot of these weapons are actually pretty useful. Literally any of these I would use on most playthroughs. So yeah, pretty good list. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you guys think about the list. Maybe there's some details about certain weapons that I missed, or that I overlooked or underlooked, overweight, underweight, whatever. Maybe you got some different opinions on what I put where. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. But anyways, that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe and all that. I definitely enjoy that. Definitely helps out the channel. And with that being said, I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out. That's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, show the algorithm some love and hit that like button for me. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already to stay up to date on all my latest gaming content. Of course, for as little as 99 cents a month, you can become a channel member and help support the channel monetarily. On that note, I'd like to give a special shout out to my active channel members. Thank you all for your continued support. It is definitely greatly appreciated, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace out.